currency.
The New World Order.
Those are the roots of trouble.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's live edition. It is April 16th, 2013. And tonight I'm going to be diving back into the weirdness that is going on with this bombing at the Boston Marathon. And I'm going to cover a few different things. I'm going to cover a little bit about the bombing itself, but more so the reaction by the media. I notice everybody's favorite conspiracy theorist to hate on, Jones, seems to be a talking point now ever since he went out on CNN and had it out with Piers Morgan. And I know he had been used as a talking point here or there before, but now it seems that he is a talking point. Well, what do I mean? Well, I heard a local radio DJ down here on the AM who does a morning show 5 days a week, bring him up without saying his name or his website because he didn't want to give him any hits, according to him. But he bashed the idea of any type of conspiracy theory involving this bombing at all. Said, why does it have to be politicized right off the bat? Well, I mean, that's a complete straw man argument, by the way. It's a straw point. It's a straw man argument based on a talking point that he was given. And I say it's a talking point because then on CNN I find an article, and in this article on CNN, what do I see? But the very same talking point, it has 5 of the craziest or most wrong disinformation stories, whatever the title is. I'll look it up and I'll read it to you later. But I found it on CNN earlier today, and it's about people posting stuff on Twitter, how it's misinformation, or maybe they took a picture and they just put whatever kind of caption they wanted on it, and it shows 4 different real examples, and then number 5 is Alex Jones tweeting that it could be a false flag. And then, although the CNN article did actually explain what the false flag event was, the local DJ here compared the term false flag to video fakery. And then he brought up Professor James Tracy, the FAU professor who they tried to slaughter, and he was like, and that moron FAU professor down here. That's a straw man argument. That's how you build a straw man. You're given a talking point as one of these radio heads, well-known mouthpieces on the radio, and then you build your own little attack against it. But it's not a real argument. It's not a valid argument. It doesn't answer any questions. It just attacks. Logical fallacy. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break. We'll be back in a few minutes. Don't go anywhere. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. So, I don't really need to defend Jones himself. and I'm not going to, because that in itself would be almost a straw man argument. That would be goading me into an argument that's not really the main argument. They would be making it about him. But ever since that his appearance on Piers Morgan, and I said it was like they set him up to, as now that he went off like that, now they have this frame of reference to go back to all the time, and they constantly are. And what they're attacking him for is one of his reporters yesterday happened to be, got in his vehicle, did whatever he had to do. The guy lives up in the Northeast, Dan Bidandi, and he drove over to the press conference, and he asked a legitimate question, whether or not it was a false flag, or do they think it might be a false flag perpetrated to take away, rights, blah, 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 something to that effect. I don't remember how the exact question was worded, but it was a legitimate question. I mean, why can't you ask, why is asking that question no good, but then Chris Matthews can go on air and say that it's probably right-wing extremists? I mean, they don't have any clue, but the media is out there trying to push, it's the right wing, it's the right wing, it's the right-wing extremists, it's always the right wing, they probably like guns, they're probably pissed off about not being able to have guns because we want to take them away, so we should take away their guns and jail all of them, and take away their free speech, right? I mean, that's what you hear coming out of MSNBC, even CNN. They're pushing, it must be right-wing extremists. Wolf Blitzer. But that's okay. No one critiques that. No one says anything about that, right? But if a reporter asks a legitimate question about false flags, that's just conspiracy kookery. So the local DJ down here was attacking, or talk show host, I should say, whatever you want to call him, if that's what you want to call him. He was attacking the fact that somebody would ask that question. He said, it reminds me of that dumb FAU professor. And, the families of the dead kids invited him to come to the funerals. And he went, and again, he was talking about Professor James Tracy. And then he went on to say that the idiot who asked the question should be forced to go to the funeral of the 8-year-old who died. And that was how he responded to any type of false flag. And then he, concept. And then again, he put it out there that false flag, he didn't even give the definition of false flag, which actually it's a military term. Okay, it comes from flying false flags on your vessel. And then you would get up close, like if you were a privateer and you wanted to take out the British, or say you wanted to take out the French, and you were a privateer working for the British, this actually happened. They would roll up on a French ship with a French flag, and the French would go, "Oh, it's just a French ship. Come on over closer." And they would, they would not worry about manning their guns. They would let their guard down, and then when they got in close, the privateer would drop their flag, put up the flag of England or their pirate flag or whatever, and open up. Even regular pirates that weren't privateers did this kind of thing. Okay. Flying a false flag. That's where the term comes from, roughly. You can go look up a bit more detailed version of where it comes from, but that's roughly where it comes from. So the concept is now conspiracy kookery. And if you say false flag, it goes from the official definition to video fakery and that the event never happened and it was all faked. And that's not what anybody said. That's not what, and I have to give him credit. That's not what Dan Bidandi asked. He didn't say if it was video fakery. He said false flag, meaning, do you think the government, maybe did this to take away rights, which is a huge possibility. It's very plausible. It's happened in the past. But nope, he's a conspiracy tard, and you can't take him seriously. And the argument against it, instead of this host saying some sort of information logically and throwing it back. Nope. He used appeal to emotion. He got all very somber with his voice, and he was like, it just makes me mad. It just makes me mad. Well, it doesn't matter if it makes you mad, okay? It really doesn't matter. Your emotions have nothing to do with this whatsoever. But you know what you're doing, Mr. Talking Mouth, right? You know exactly what you're doing. They put you in front of that mic for a reason. There's a reason that these people, they gave him talking points. And at first I thought it was him attacking just the idea. And I was like, this guy's an idiot. And then when I saw the CNN article, I was like, hey, wait a minute. That's the exact same talking point. So this talking point is already floating around out there. Now, I'm going to play a clip for you from the Corbett Report It's from 2011, but it's pertinent to this day. It's titled "When False Flags Don't Fly Anymore." Okay, and this will maybe give the people that don't understand why people would say, "Oh, false flag this," or "the government did that." Maybe this will help them understand why people are, no longer believing what they're fed, and they're looking beyond it. Let's take a listen.
Those who have studied history know that nothing invigorates and empowers an authoritarian regime more than a spectacular act of violence, some sudden and senseless loss of life that allows the autocrat to stand on the smoking rubble and identify himself as the hero. It's at moments like this that the public, still in shock from the horror of the tragedy that has just unfolded before them, can be led into the most ruthless despotism that now bears the mantle of security. Acts of terror and violence never benefit the average man or woman. They only ever benefit those in positions of power. This is why Nero fiddled while Rome burned. It gave him a chance to throw out the Christians to the lions and rebuild the capital of the Roman Empire in his own image. This is why Hearst and the warmongers of the emerging American Empire were delighted by the destruction of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898. It gave them the excuse they needed to rouse the public into supporting the Spanish-American War. This is why Israel attacked the USS Liberty in 1967 during the Six-Day War, strafing and torpedoing it relentlessly for hours in a vain attempt to send it to the bottom. The Israelis believed that the loss of the Liberty could be blamed on Egypt and draw the Americans into war. This is why there are hundreds of documented examples of government staging attacks in order to blame them on their political enemies. In every civilization, in every culture, in every historical period, authoritarians have known that spectacular acts of violence help to further consolidate their own power and control. And sadly, throughout history, there have been all too many willing to allow attacks to occur, to pretend that attacks have occurred, or even to attack their own population in order to further their political agenda. To think that such staged provocations and false flag attacks no longer occur would be as unrealistic as believing that human nature itself has changed, that powerful people no longer seek to increase their power, that influence is never used for deceit or manipulation, that lies are no longer told to satisfy greed or slake the thirst for control. It is to believe that our society is immune from those things that we have seen in every other society, in every other era. In short, it's a dangerous delusion. The people are once again learning the power of this delusion. They are learning the extent to which they have been lied to. They are once again studying their history. The Russians are learning how the FSB was caught planting bombs in Moscow in 1999 during a terror scare that swept Putin into power and stirred the public into supporting the Second Chechen War. They are learning how their autocratic ex-president came to power campaigning on the graves of those his old FSB cronies had killed. The Israelis are learning how Mossad has been caught time and again posing as the very Muslim terrorists they claim to be opposing. They are learning how Israel uses the specter of terror to further extend their blank check drawn on American funds to expand their police state at home and maintain their hardline stance, the world's sixth largest nuclear superpower supposedly threatened by the possibility that one of their neighbors may one day obtain a single nuclear weapon. The British are learning how their SAS officers were caught dressing up as Arabs in Iraq, driving around with trucks full of munitions, shooting at police to stir up ethnic tensions, and ensure that permanent bases could be built in the region. They are learning how Harun Aswat, the supposed mastermind behind the 7/7 bombings, was working for British intelligence. They are learning how British military intelligence took part in IRA bombings. The Indians are learning how the Mumbai attack was helped by a US agent who is cooperating with investigators so that he won't face questioning by foreign authorities. The Canadians are learning how their own provincial police dressed up as protesters in 2007 and threatened violence against other police in order to force a crackdown on peaceful protests. And the Americans. The Americans are learning that there were multiple bombs found, dismantled, and taken out of the Alfred P. Murrah building on April 19, 1995. They are learning that Timothy McVeigh had written a letter to his sister in which he claimed to be in the Special Forces for the U.S. Army. They are learning the bombing was being directed by FBI informants, just as the 1993 World Trade Center bombing was. They are learning about 9/11 and the Gulf of Tonkin and Operation Northwoods and their own Army counterinsurgency manuals that teach officers how to commit false flag attacks to blame on their enemies. In short, the people are learning the truth. And now we see the same build-up to a false flag event taking place that we saw in 1995. At that time, the U.S. had a corporate media desperate to fling mud at anyone concerned by the actions of their government, and it had a government that was desperately unpopular. Today, we see the exact same factors at play. If anything, the situation today is worse than it was in the run-up to the Oklahoma City bombing, with media consolidation meaning that groups of concerned citizens like the Oath Keepers are being attacked by the controlled minions on both the left and the right. And now it is not just the militia that is being demonized by the establishment. It is veterans and gun owners, third-party supporters and libertarians, anti-war protesters, and human rights campaigners, people who are upset with a government giving trillions to the banks that have engineered our current financial crisis. In short, everyone is now a potential terrorist according to the governmental and media agencies that deign to limit our range of acceptable opinion and control dissent. Even the word terrorist means something more than it did back in 1995, now after the false flag attack of 2001 allowed the passage of the Patriot Act, after the boogeyman of Al-Qaeda gave the NSA the opportunity to announce that they were collecting everyone's emails and everyone's telephone calls, after the former White House press secretary came out and admitted that the Bush administration had made up terror threats in order to scare the people into supporting the government, now we know what the real definition of terrorism is. It is governments scaring their own populations into line. But there is something else that's different now from what it was in 1995. The people are learning something else about terrorism. They are not terrorists for speaking out against their government. They are not terrorists for wanting the government to stop selling their children into servitude to pay bankers their bonuses. They are not terrorists for pointing out that the FBI and the CIA and Mossad and MI6 are behind every major international terrorist event. The people are not terrorists because they do not want to see more death. They do not want more destruction. The spilling of the blood of their fellow citizens is not in their interests. Death and destruction only ever serve the governmental and financial and industrial interests who always grow in power and wealth in the wake of every tragedy. Time and again, the people pay with their lives, and the governments and the banks and the war machine only grows and prospers. The people do not want terrorism because it does not benefit them. It only benefits the existing power structure. And this time, if there is another staged event to blame on the government's enemy of the day, the people will know who to blame. For the Corbett Report in Western Japan, I am James Corbett.
I think it still holds true to this day, even though he made it 2 years ago. Very pertinent, ladies and gentlemen. What did I say the other day? Who benefits? Certainly not some rogue, ragtag terror group, homegrown terror group, right? Or even an outside group. That would just bring the iron boot of tyranny down upon them. So they're going to know that. How would they benefit? Well, they don't care about that Popeye. Oh, they don't? That it has no effect on how they operate, really? You don't think anybody might have learned from what happened to Al-Qaeda after quote-unquote 9/11? If you actually believe the official story, right? We broke Al-Qaeda's back. Right? Please. Pay attention. There's a lot of reasons they could pull this thing off. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break. We'll be right back. And again, I'm not saying it definitely is, but man, it reeks like one. We're right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Short segment. On the other side, I'm going to get into a few other things. Next hour, I'm going to cover the Family Guy aspect of it. I'm sure you've all heard by now that about 3 weeks ago, there was a Family Guy episode that Peter Griffin, the main character of the show, wins the Boston Marathon. And the one picture of it, he's in his car, and he's driving over all the marathoners, and there's this smoke and fire, and there's bloody body parts all over the place. There's blood all over the car. And he's talking to a news anchor. And then another piece of the same show, it obviously didn't follow it right up, but it was another video snippet from the same episode. his friends and him are at a bar, and they're asking him how he won, and he's got a cell phone in his hand, and he dials a phone number, and it lights a bomb off. And he goes, oops, wrong number, dials another number, and lights off another bomb. And you hear people screaming, and obviously. And this only aired 3 weeks ago. So I'll get into that, too, and why they do things like that, and what the deal is, because a lot of people don't quite understand why they would throw it in your face like that and say, hey, look what we're doing. But they do just that. Anyway, more on the conspiracy angle of it for a moment. You do realize that they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, because although some people, they were trying to push the lone wolf aspect of it, even the mainstream media talking heads yesterday were like, well, this has to be the work of a group. It can't be the work of one man, one lone individual. It has to be the work of a group. It has to be the work of a group. And there were the people that were trying to say, well, it could be a lone wolf, but yeah, it might be the work of a group, maybe Al-Qaeda. Well, okay, I'd hate to break the news to people, but guess what? If it was more than one person, if it was two or more people who plotted to detonate those bombs, because that would be a bad thing, right? That's by definition a conspiracy. And if they say it was a real terrorist, right, real bad guy, and they caught the guy, and it wasn't some state-sponsored false flaggery type crap, it's the real thing. You know what happens when he goes to court? You know what one of the charges he's going to get charged with? Conspiracy. Probably conspiracy to commit terrorism. Conspiracy to detonate bombs or whatever. I'm sure that the prosecutor will come up with something, but it'll be conspiracy to whatever. Or he'd be charged as part of a conspiracy. So the attack, the pejorative term, the pejorative use of the term conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorist is wrong. I've talked about it in previous broadcasts. The term conspiracy theory as a pejorative, as we know it today, as this label that's slapped on anybody, it dates back to the Kennedy assassination. The term goes back, there is written use where it dates back further than that, but not as a pejorative label the way the intelligence community put it out there after the assassination of President Kennedy, and it's stuck. It was used back then for anybody that didn't believe that a lone gunman killed the president. Hence, you believed in a conspiracy of more than two or more people, more than one, to kill the president. And that meant you were a conspiracy theorist. And it became a label, and it is now used in the pejorative sense to attack people and label them and marginalize them. Now, why would you want to marginalize people? Oh, wait a minute. I get why you'd want to marginalize people. Because if you marginalize them and you label them and you have them pushed off into a corner, you can demonize them. And then you can get the main morons, the rest of the mass general public against them. And then you'll marginalize another group. Where have I seen this before? I know I've seen this somewhere before in history. Oh, that's right, not too long ago. When the Nazis were in power. It's a tactic that's been used over and over and over again. And the Nazis aren't the only ones that have used it. Other regimes throughout history, tyrannical regimes, have as well. It's a tried-true method in their little playbook. It's time people woke up and saw the truth. And they are. And that's why you have these attacks on conspiracy theories right away now. They would never even mention the term conspiracy theories or anything 5 years ago when something happened until later on if they wanted to make fun of people or attack them. Now, it's in the headlines the next day. That means we're having an impact. We're going to break. We'll bring it back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. So, what exactly is an ad hominem attack? Does anyone know? I'm sure some of the listeners know, but I'm willing to bet that a lot of you don't. You'll hear it in the coming days on, quote, conspiracy theorists, right? Now I'm going to get back into some of the evidence as to why the people are looking at things and saying this is shady, that's shady. We'll get back into that in a few minutes, definitely the second hour, but I have enough time that I want to explain to you guys, and that's what I planned out here for tonight. I want to explain to you guys a little bit about fallacies, so that if you understand the fallacies better and what to look for, when they happen and when they're done and when you see them, you'll be able to spot them. It's important that you understand ad hominem, straw man, even red herring. But the media loves to use ad hominem and straw man, or build a straw man argument using ad hominem fallacies during the course of the straw man. Now, what exactly is an ad hominem attack? Or an ad hominem fallacy? What exactly is a straw man fallacy? Well, before I get into detail really about what an ad hominem fallacy is, I should really let you understand what a straw figure fallacy is, a straw person, a straw man argument is. It is an argument that is created distorting, a distortion of the original argument, because they can't defeat the real argument. So, like, if I said to you, while 9/11 was perpetrated by a rogue element inside the government, and you say, oh, so you think that George Bush sat in his office and sat and pushed the plunger himself while watching it on some video feed. He wasn't even in his office that day, you moron. So your argument is invalid. Well, I didn't say that. You twisted and tweaked the argument into a weaker form, and then you attack that weaker argument, and then you declare victory over the weaker argument. But you never really had any argument to begin with, because you didn't really address the original statement. If people can't follow what I just said, I have a little bit of audio to play you. And I'm going to play these for you, over the coming weeks to help you learn a little bit about different fallacies and stuff. Because if you understand this, ladies and gentlemen, then when they do things like this, when you see things like this bombing happen, you'll be able to watch the news and go, that's a lie, that's an appeal to emotion, that's a straw man argument, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And it's important that you have that ability, okay? Remember, I could give you the fish, and you could eat for a day, or I could teach you to fish, and you eat for a lifetime. So how about I teach you to fish? Here we go. Let's start with the straw man fallacy.
We're moving on now to fallacies that involve what I've called violations of the rules of rational argumentation. The rules in question are things like being able and willing to reason well, not being willing to lie or distort things simply to win an argument, and so on. The first fallacy of this type that we'll look at is more commonly known as the straw man fallacy. For the sake of gender equity, I'm going to call it straw figure, since there's no reason to think that men are the only ones who commit this fallacy or who are taken in by it. The name comes from the practice of using human figures made of straw as practice dummies in military training. Obviously, it's easier and safer to practice certain combat techniques when your opponent is made of straw. The fallacy works like this. Alice offers an argument to Bob. She wants to convince him of something. Let's say that Alice's argument is really pretty strong, like this boxer. Bob isn't sure he can handle this argument. So instead of trying to refute Alice's actual argument, Bob decides to engage a different argument. He decides to engage this straw figure. What is the straw figure? It's a weaker, distorted version of Alice's original argument. Because it's weaker, Bob is easily able to refute the straw figure argument. The straw figure fallacy is complete when Bob does the dance of joy and claims that he has successfully refuted Alice's original argument. But of course, Bob hasn't refuted the original argument. He's only refuted a distorted misrepresentation of it. This is the straw figure or straw man fallacy. This fallacy is often categorized as a fallacy of relevance because the attacks made on the weak straw figure are irrelevant to judging the actual strengths and weaknesses of the original argument. And this is correct, but I prefer to think of it as a violation of the rules of rational argumentation, especially when it involves knowingly and willfully misrepresenting an argument. When someone is willing to do this, they're no longer playing by the rules. They're more concerned with the appearance of winning than with argumentation itself. When you see this going on, you should try to correct the misrepresentation and get the discussion back on track. If it's an honest mistake and the arguer is willing to correct their misunderstanding, that's great. But if you catch them doing this again and again, then there's probably no point in engaging argumentatively with this person, because they've shown you that they're not willing to play by the rules. Let's look at an example. Jennifer has just finished giving her argument against mandatory prayer in public schools. Let's assume that her argument focused on separation of church and state and the First Amendment, and the importance of respecting religious diversity in a multicultural society. Now, Bob responds like this. It's clear from your argument that you're really advocating for atheism. We've seen what state-sanctioned atheism does to societies. Look at Russia under Stalin, or China under Mao. Is that what you want for this country? The suppression of religious freedom and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state? It's clear that Bob isn't responding to Jennifer's original argument. He's responding to a distorted misrepresentation of it, a straw figure. Appeals to religious diversity or separation of church and state are just as often made by religious people as by non-religious people. But if Bob can reframe the argument so that it looks like an argument for atheism and abolishing all forms of religious expression, then that's a much easier argument to refute. Rhetorically, this kind of move can be very powerful, and that's why straw figure arguments are so common in public debates on hot-button topics. But from a logic standpoint, they represent a willful refusal to engage in genuine argumentation.
Bam. One of the best pieces of information I could give you, ladies and gentlemen, is to teach you this stuff, to show you this stuff. And I urge you to not just turn the broadcast off after at midnight and go, well, I'm good to go. I know all there is to know. No, you don't. Go out and educate yourselves more about this. Learn about fallacies. Go out and pick up books about rational argumentation, about debate. That's what the quote-unquote debate club actually would teach people, is actually how to have rational debates. Well, unless the person running it back in the day was irrational, then you were screwed because it was public school after all, but they don't teach this stuff in school anymore. Maybe certain places, but most schools don't teach this stuff anymore. People don't even know what a fallacy is. They'll say, Popeye, what's a fallacy? Because I use the term fallacy all the time. Well, you just heard an example of what a straw man fallacy is. But if I say what's a fallacy, people are going to say, or if I say, well, don't commit a fallacy, or don't do this, or don't do that, people are going to say, well, what is a fallacy to begin with? Well, let's cover that really quick, because I only have a few minutes left before we go to break, and I want to make sure I get this on the air for you so you all can understand this and get a chance, even if you go back and listen to the rebroad multiple times. It's important to learn this stuff so you can see through the lies.
In this tutorial, we'll look at the basic definition of a fallacy. Here's a very general definition of a fallacy. A fallacy is an argument of a type that is generally recognized to be bad. So, first and foremost, a fallacy is a bad argument. But not every bad argument should be labeled a fallacy. What makes it a fallacy is that the argument has certain general features that allow you to characterize it as a type, and it is these general features that are responsible for the argument being bad. This allows you to say that a given argument is bad because it's an example or instance of a particular kind of argument that is generally recognized to be bad. Here's an example we've seen already. If John exercises every day and watches what he eats, then he'll lose weight. John lost weight, so he must be exercising every day and watching what he eats. This argument is bad because the logic is weak. From the fact that John has lost weight, it doesn't follow that he's exercising every day and watching what he eats. He could be restricting his diet and not exercising at all. Or he could be exercising and not changing his diet. Or he could be sick and bedridden and he's lost weight for that reason, and so on. What makes this a fallacy is that we can recognize that this is an argument of a certain general type. It's an instance of the invalid conditional argument form known as affirming the consequent. For this reason, this is called the fallacy of affirming the consequent. This is an example of what is called a formal or structural fallacy, because the argument form is invalid. But not all fallacies are formal in this way. Here's an example. It's okay to lie on your taxes. Everyone does it. This is a bad argument. but it's not bad because of its structural form. It's bad because it relies on an assumed premise that most of us would reject. Here's how you might reconstruct this argument. The assumed premise is something like, if everyone does something, then it's okay to do it. When you reconstruct the argument in this way, the logic is perfectly fine. It's a valid argument. The problem is with that first general premise. Most people would reject the view that an action is morally all right as long as everyone does it. What if you lived in a slave culture and everyone practiced slavery? Would that make slavery morally okay? This is sometimes called the bandwagon fallacy, or the appeal to common practice, and it's an example of what is usually called a content fallacy. A content fallacy is a fallacy that relies on a false or dubious premise of a certain kind. Note that here the second premise is false too. Not everyone lies on their taxes. But simply having a false premise isn't enough to make an argument guilty of a content fallacy. It's a content fallacy only if the major premise that the argument is relying on is of a certain general type that would be judged as false or dubious in the particular case in question. In this case, it's the first premise, the general premise that relates common practice to moral acceptability, that is responsible for this being a fallacious argument. An important point to remember about fallacies is that you can't judge an argument based on its superficial form as given, since we often leave out parts and rely on our audience to fill in the gaps. So if I give an argument like this, whales can't breathe underwater, they're mammals. It would be unfair to say, for example, that it's bad because it's logically weak, since there's no stated connection between being a mammal and being able to breathe underwater. In other words, it would be unreasonable to evaluate the argument based on this interpretation and argue that the logic is weak. Why? Because it's obvious that the argument relies on an implicit premise. Mammals can't breathe underwater. Only after you add this premise can you then evaluate the argument. And in this case, the argument is good. Both premises are true and the argument is valid. So, let's summarize. 1. A fallacy is an argument of a type that is generally recognized to be bad. And 2. You should evaluate an argument only after the argument has been reconstructed to include any implicit or assumed premises. Very often, the fallacy only becomes obvious after you reconstructed the reasoning.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. A little introduction into fallacies. When we come back, I'll get a little bit further into detail about them, and then I want to get back into, when we come back in hour number 2, I want to get back into some of the things about the bombing at the Boston Marathon yesterday. But it's important that we sidetrack ourselves for a few minutes to understand these things, to understand what a fallacy is, to understand the basic concepts of this. I would really hope that this urges anyone that hears this to go out and educate themselves further about logical fallacies, about the trivium, about logical debate and logical argument rather than emotional argument. And what has the media and the government done? They've only stoked your emotions. They haven't come on air and said, calm down. They've said, we'll get whoever did this. We'll be right back. Stoking fear is what they do best. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. 2 more fallacies, and then we get back into some other information. Something I want to point out again, because they're saying that there's no evidence to support that. I'll get into it in the second hour. But first, I want to get back into the fallacies. Again, if you can spot these and if you can learn what they are, you'll be able to see through the crap. And look, I see the garbage being pumped out already, so it's important that I dedicate the time to let you all hear this. And I urge you, please, 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 go back and listen to the archive over and over again so you can listen to at least this section about the logical fallacies. And I'll give you some information where you can research some of this a little bit further for yourself when we're all done. But first, let's get to the next fallacy, because we're short on time, and that would be the red herring fallacy. Here we go.
Red herring is another well-known fallacy type, but it's easily confused with straw figure. So here I want to highlight the differences between the two. The name red herring comes from an old method of training dogs for fox hunting. The goal is to train the dogs to follow the fox's scent, even if the dogs encounter other smells that are potentially distracting. So what they do is they let the fox go, so the fox leaves a scent trail. Then, before letting the dogs go, they drag a bunch of smelly red herrings across the fox's trail, like this. Then they release the dogs. When the dogs hit the herring trail, they'll be distracted by the smell, and some will be inclined to follow the herring trail instead. So the trainers try to get the dogs to stay on the fox trail and resist the urge to follow the herring. So what's what with this metaphor? Well, the fox is some argument, the original argument that is at issue in a debate. The dog can represent anyone who is interested and engaged in this argument. The red herring is something that distracts you from following the trail of the original argument. It might be a new and different argument that raises a different issue, or simply an irrelevant comment that distracts from the main issue. What's important is that it's distracting enough to make the audience want to follow this new trail, away from the original argument and the main issue. So putting all this together, you commit the red herring fallacy when, in an argument, you divert attention away from the main issue or the main line of argumentation by introducing something that changes the subject, that raises a new issue that isn't relevant to the preceding line of discussion. The fallacy really occurs when you then conclude something from this different issue, or presume that some conclusion has been established, and use this to claim that you've won the argument or said something relevant about the original argument. In this respect, the fallacy is very much like a straw figure fallacy, in that you are mistakenly or misleadingly saying that you've won an argument or refuted an argument when all that you've really done is avoid engaging the original argument. But it's different from the straw figure fallacy in that a straw figure involves distorting or misrepresenting some original argument and then knocking down the distorted argument. In a red herring, the arguer ignores the opponent's argument and subtly changes the subject. So to distinguish between the two, you need to ask yourself whether the arguer has knocked down a distorted argument or simply changed the subject. Here's a summary of the points just made. To illustrate the difference, consider this. I overheard my friend John argue that the Bible has errors in it. Funny, I never figured him for an atheist. This is a straw figure, not a red herring, since the conclusion being drawn is related to the main argument that his friend is making about the Bible. But it's clearly working off of a distorted or exaggerated version of it, if it equates biblical fallibilism with atheism. Now compare that to this one. My opponent has argued that there's an urgent need to reduce greenhouse gases in order to minimize global warming. But the most serious problem facing future generations is the risk posed by nuclear weapons in the hands of rogue states and terrorists. This is where we need to focus our attention and resources. This is a red herring. The original issue was about greenhouse gases and the urgency of global warming. This response sidesteps that issue and introduces a new issue. To avoid committing a red herring, the arguer would need to show that global warming isn't an urgent problem, or that reducing greenhouse gas emissions won't be effective in reducing it, or something like that. Nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists is certainly a serious issue, but that fact does nothing to undermine the original argument about global warming.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen, and that is the red herring fallacy. Now, you can learn more about a lot of these fallacies over on the YouTube channel that I'm actually using the audio from. I've used his different playlists for years now. He's got a podcast called The Critical Thinker Podcast. You can go check him out over on YouTube. Look him up under Kevin De La Plante. Kevin, and his last name is lowercase d-e, capital L-A-P-L-A-N-T-E. And he's got a whole bunch of different playlists, like Introduction to Fallacies, Reasoning with Probabilities, just all about good argument based on logic and not, emotion. So go check it out. When we get back, I'm going to finish up with ad hominem and the then we're going to get into the bombing itself again. So stay tuned. We will be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 here on tonight's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Popeye, from FederalJack.com. It is April 16th, 2013. And tonight I have been going over certain aspects of the Boston bombing, not so much getting into the bombing itself, which I will have time to in the coming days, but so far I've been covering really the reaction to just asking questions and the media's reaction to it, how they are acting like a bunch of attack dogs. And in order to show you properly what they do, I've been letting you listen to some audio, educating you all, teaching you whatever term you want to use. I don't really like the term educating because that makes me think of, sitting kids in a desk and programming their little heads with whatever crap in a public school domain. But I've been letting you listen so that you can enlighten yourselves, put it that way, to audio, enlightening everyone about what fallacies are. And it's important that you learn this stuff. It's important that I hear it. It's important that everyone hears it. It's important that it goes out across the airwaves and it's out there, roaming the internet, literally roaming the airwaves. Once that stuff is broadcast, it's out in outer space just bouncing around. It's important that people understand these things. If you can't spot a logical fallacy, you're going to fall prey to them. Now that you've heard just some of these, and I promise you, if you go back and you listen to the archive a couple times, and you just listen, don't try to look at anything on the screen, just put your feet back, grab a glass, that's a tongue twister, grab a glass of wine or coffee or whatever your poison is, and sit back and just put your feet up and listen to the logical fallacy part. Okay, listen to the explanation of what they are, and just, even if you have to close your eyes to let you focus solely on that, focus on it and let your brain absorb it and soak it in. It's important. It really is. Once it's in your brain, I swear it's like having the sunglasses on. This will really help you. Everybody says, Popeye, how can you look at the media and just tear them apart the way you do? It's real simple. I see them for what they are, and I call things like I see them. I'm not Superman, ladies and gentlemen. So my goal is to make you all be able to see things the way I do, openly and clearly, and then let you make your own decisions based on that. And trust me, most people that see the things the way they are, they get sickened by it, and they're forced to do something. I've met some of the coolest people over the years doing this, and you know what? One thing that most of them all have in common is that they come from completely different backgrounds, all different aspects of life. And the one thing that they realize that we all have in common is freedom. Doesn't matter what God you worship. If you don't, doesn't matter what you believe in, what you love. If you don't have the freedom to love it, believe in it, or pray to it, guess what? It's that like one glue that binds us all together through all the BS differences that they try to throw out there. Freedom. We're going to break. We'll be right back. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. All right, final fallacy of the day was the first one that I brought up. The ad hominem, which you will see crazy, kooky conspiracy theorists, those retards, those idiots, those morons. Oh, you hear it all the time coming from these supposed educated talking heads, talking mouthpieces, repeaters, whatever you want to call them. The real morons, if you want to throw around ad hominems. But I know, I shouldn't fall into that pit of garbage. I shouldn't allow myself and lower myself into that cesspool. But sometimes it's just hard not to. Anyway, the ad hominem fallacy.
Ad hominem is the name of a well-known fallacy type. The name is derived from Latin, meaning to the man or to the person. It's the fallacy of rejecting a claim or an argument given by someone because we don't like something about the person. We're mistaking criticism of a person with criticism of a claim or an argument. There are several different kinds of ad hominem fallacies. In this video, we'll look at the most blatant form of ad hominem, the abusive ad hominem. Here's the most blatant form of this most blatant form of ad hominem. Your argument is bad because you suck. This is a fallacy because even if it's true that you suck, your sucking isn't relevant to the goodness or badness of your argument. If your argument is bad, it's bad because it has a dubious premise, or it has weak logic, or some other necessary condition for an argument to be good is violated. Your sucking might be a reason not to like you personally, but it's not a reason to reject your argument. Here's a less blatant and more challenging example. In his book Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler gives his account of race and history, and famously argues for the superiority of the Aryan race and the inferiority of Jewish people. Now, what if I said that we should reject Hitler's arguments because he was a mass murderer, or an insane megalomaniac, or racist and anti-Semitic, or whatever other nasty thing you want to say about him? Let's say that these nasty things are all true. Would these true facts about Hitler's character give us good reason to reject Hitler's arguments about racial differences? And here's a case where a lot of people, maybe most people, will say that this does give us good reason to reject his arguments. But if we accept that the ad hominem is indeed a fallacy, that it's a mistake to reject an argument based solely on qualities of the person giving the argument, then we have to reject the argument given here. This does not give us good reason to reject Hitler's arguments. Now, I think Hitler's arguments are bad, and I'm hoping that most people viewing this do too. But the point is that they're not bad because Hitler was bad. They're bad because they violate one or more of the necessary conditions for an argument to be good. This works the other way too, of course. If Mother Teresa gives an argument for giving charity and aid to the poor, and we think Mother Teresa is a moral saint, that shouldn't by itself count as a reason to accept her argument for giving aid to the poor. We wouldn't normally call this an ad hominem fallacy, of course, since the term is usually associated with criticism rather than praise. But it's still a fallacy, and for the exact same reasons. The problem isn't with criticism or praise, it's with confusing the judging of a person with the judging of an argument. Now, let's look at this example from an argument analysis perspective. Let's ignore the fact that we've already labeled it an ad hominem fallacy, and ask ourselves how we would normally assess the argument using the tools we've learned so far. Well, there are two basic questions to ask. Does the argument satisfy the truth condition, and does it satisfy the logic condition? In other words, number one, are all the premises true or plausible? And number two, is the argument valid or strong? If the answer to either of these is no, then the argument is bad. Well, premise one is clearly true. And premise two, well, it uses a lot of loaded and judgmental language, would be regarded as true, or at least defensible, by many people. As the argument is given, the problem isn't with the truth of the premises. As given, the problem is with the logic. If those two premises are true, the conclusion doesn't follow either with certainty or with high probability. In other words, the logic of the argument is neither valid nor strong. It's weak. So, one way to evaluate this argument is simply to say that, as given, it's bad because the logic is weak. And that's true. But I want you to recall now the discussion about putting arguments in standard form way back in the first tutorial course on basic concepts in logic and argumentation. There, we emphasize that arguments are often presented as incomplete and rely on background assumptions to be interpreted correctly. An argument might be weak as given, but it might be relying on a background premise that would make it strong or valid. So in general, you're always encouraged to look for implicit background assumptions like this, and only evaluate the argument after you've reconstructed an argument. And that means making explicit any background assumptions that the argument is relying on. Only then should you go ahead and evaluate whether the argument is good or bad. So, does this argument rely on a background premise that makes the argument valid or strong? Well, it's not hard to see what would be required to make the logic work. Let's shrink this up so we have more room to work. You can often use a simple conditional claim, if A then B, or a generalization like all A or B, to fix the logic of an argument. So here, you might add a conditional claim like this. If Hitler was a murderous, megalomaniacal anti-Semite, then his arguments on racial superiority are very likely bad. If you add the very likely, then the argument is just strong. If you take it out, then it's valid. It's acceptable to add an assumed premise like this because it's clear that we're not putting words in the arguer's mouth. We have every reason to think that someone advancing this argument would accept a premise like that. So, with this reconstruction, we fixed the logical problem. It's not appropriate anymore to say that the argument is bad because the logic is weak. The logic is fine. The problem now is with the plausibility of that assumed premise. If this argument is bad, it's bad because this assumed premise is false or dubious. Now, this is a hard case for some people because it's still very tempting to think that this kind of character flaw is relevant to assessing the goodness of the arguments given. But now I hope it's clear why this is a mistake. An argument is a collection of claims linked by relations of logical entailment or support. The plausibility or implausibility of those claims and the validity or invalidity of the argument given isn't determined by facts about the moral character of the person asserting the argument. I grant that in cases like this, it's tempting to make the slide from criticism of a person to criticism of an argument, but that's a mistake. The value of discussing a hard case like this is that if you can see the fallacy here, then you've probably understood the essence of the fallacy. Facts about someone's moral character by themselves don't make it any more or less likely that their arguments are good or bad. So our final assessment is that this is a bad argument, and it's bad because the background assumption necessary to make the argument valid or strong is false or dubious. So it violates the truth condition, as we've defined that term. This might seem like a long-winded way of saying that the argument is fallacious, but the point of this discussion is to show why it's a fallacy, why ad hominems in general are fallacies, by showing how the argument violates one of the basic conditions for an argument to be good. Now, to sum up, we can say a few things in general about ad hominems. When you reconstruct them, ad hominem arguments typically rely on the following types of assumed premise. Almost any claim that a person makes about topic X is probably false because of some feature of that person, or almost any argument that a person gives about X is probably bad because of some feature of that person. If you include the terms in brackets, you get a more qualified version of the premise that would make the argument strong rather than valid. Now, the characterization given here is somewhat broader than your typical abusive ad hominem. You get your typical ad hominem when you base your objection on a criticism of someone's character. But this broader characterization is helpful because it also covers ad hominem cases that don't necessarily involve insulting a person or criticizing their character, as we'll see in the next couple of tutorials. Finally, I want to direct your attention to the whenever in that final statement on the bottom. You commit an ad hominem fallacy when you give an argument that relies on premises of this type, but it's only a fallacy if the premise is false. I want to point this out because, as most textbooks will tell you, premises of this type aren't always false. And in these cases, the arguments don't commit the ad hominem fallacy. Here's an example. Johnny is on the witness stand testifying against Mrs. Jones in a murder case. He says that he saw Mrs. Jones stab her husband. The argument for her guilt relies solely on his testimony. Now, in a case like this, where an argument relies on trusting someone's testimony, facts about a person's character and motives are relevant to assessing the argument. If it's true that Johnny is a known liar, and he has a motive to lie in this case, maybe he himself is a suspect in the murder, then it makes perfect sense to reject an argument that is based solely on Johnny's testimony. So while this argument for rejecting Johnny's testimony does rely on claims about Johnny's character, it doesn't commit the ad hominem fallacy, because in this case, the claim about his character is relevant to assessing the argument. This example shows why we needed to qualify our characterization of the ad hominem in the previous slide.
And I want to interrupt that for a second because there's an important point to this, okay? There's a real important point that I want to point out. If someone comes out and says, a rogue element inside the government pulled off the Oklahoma City bombing, right? And you said, well, that's not true because you're making that up, and that person made it up, like in Johnny's case there, and the testimony solely relied on him being the only person that knew about it. There was no evidence or factual evidence to back it up. Then yes, you would be forced to judge what he's saying based on his personality and his character flaws, whether he's a liar, whether he makes things up. But if he says, no, look, here's the evidence. I have this person, this government official, this ex-government official, this person, all these documents, video footage, blah, 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 blah. Well, then it becomes an ad hominem attack, because now that really doesn't really matter if he's been a liar in the past, because here's this evidence, and you can go look it up yourself, and if it's wrong, then it would apply. But if it's correct, then it doesn't apply, and it would be an ad hominem attack.
Let's go back to that. We commit the ad hominem fallacy whenever the argument relies on premises like these, and the premises are false. It's a fallacy because the argument violates the truth condition. The premises like these aren't always false. In this case, the implicit assumption we're making about Johnny's testimony is that it's probably false. At least we don't have good reason to think it's true, because Johnny has a record of false testimony and a motive to lie in this case. And in this case, it's a perfectly reasonable assumption. So the argument doesn't violate the truth condition and consequently doesn't commit the ad hominem fallacy. Now, this discussion raises the question of whether there are any general rules for deciding when the relevant assumptions are true or false. Well, to my knowledge, this is still a subject of debate among experts in the philosophy of argumentation. But on a case-by-case basis, it's not hard to spot exceptions to the fallacy. So your best guide, I think, is to look at cases as they come up and ask yourself whether the truth or plausibility of a central premise in the argument really does turn on facts about the arguer. The best examples are arguments that rely solely on the authority or testimony of an individual. But context matters a great deal, too.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. And I hope that helps you understand rational argumentation a little bit. And again, this is a brief tip of the iceberg introduction into this. I really urge you just to go research it yourself. It doesn't take that long. This is stuff that you should have been taught in school. And just because you weren't taught in school because you went to public school, I went to public school too. You know what? I learned more teaching myself than I did from any class or any teacher I had. So, do yourself a favor and educate yourself. Look up logical fallacies, rational argumentation, learn all this stuff. Philosophy. All of this is contained under philosophy. If you go actually start to study philosophy, then all this stuff is contained under that umbrella, because then you'll find logical argumentation there. But I don't think people should get into arguments based on emotion, because look where it's gotten us so far. Again, I challenge anybody that wants to do this and videotape it and see how well it turns out for you. Make every decision in your life for 7 days based solely on emotion and not on logic. Every decision. I challenge you to do it and videotape it. I guarantee you by day 7, your life will be a living hell. Okay? Trust me. All right, we're going to break, ladies and gentlemen. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in a few minutes. We're going to get back into the bombing. Stay tuned. Rebecca in the chat says, you're wanting to watch folks self-destruct? Not good, Popeye. No. It's a challenge. When I tell people to go out and make all of their decisions based on emotion in their life for a 7-day period and record it, well, it's somewhat sarcastic when I say it, but I mean, if someone did it and they recorded it and they put it up on YouTube, it would be a very good tutorial about what happens and how things can slide downhill very fast just by making all of your decisions in your life based on emotion, which is what the media tells you to do. You know, I heard this psychologist come on. They brought her on, this same talk show host down here, this local, like I said, AM talk show host. He brings this psychologist, shrink, whatever she was on, and maybe she was a shrink, not just a psychologist. But anyway, she comes on, and she's like, well, you know, there's going to be a lot of people afraid and fear, blah, 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 blah. Don't worry about the what-ifs. Just live your life day to day. Real? That's the advice you're going to give to people? Don't worry about the what-ifs. Live your life day to day. Now, I've often said, yes, you shouldn't what-if the hell out of everything, but you should be prepared for certain situations in case of emergencies. You have your preps, you have your plans. Like when I was a kid, we had fire plans, escape plans from my house, which we actually had to use because we had a chimney fire in my house growing up, and we actually had to get out of the house before the whole thing went up, like a Roman candle. So we had a plan on how to get out of the house. My father and my mother made sure we knew how to get out of the house, and we understood the way in and out of the house. You know, so being prepared is not it's not something crazy, and you have this, you know, supposed official, right? The problem is they bring these local talking heads, right? These people that, again, and this is the same guy that was attacking quote unquote conspiracy theorists. And the only reason why conspiracy theories, by the way, exist, according to him, is to drive traffic to people's sites, so that they can sell stuff and make money. And although there are people out there that capitalize on certain situations to do that very thing, that's not the goal for anybody researching this. You could actually call what we do being real skeptics, because we don't believe the crap that we're fed by the mainstream media and the government. The faux skeptics are the ones that try to attack the quote-unquote conspiracy theorists or the independent media as nutbags, and they always end up going back to the official government story, and though that's usually their sources for things too. Official government websites, blah, 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 blah. So who's the real skeptic and who's not? Okay? And there's a lot of shady things going on. Okay? There really are. There's a lot of shady stuff going on with this whole thing. Okay? How about the fact that they came out today, the media, right? They came out and they said that there's it was Raw Story, and then there was CNN, and theirs was the Raw Story was attacking conspiracy theories, but the other one was attacking conspiracy theories, like I said, and then some of the misinformation. But they're all coming out right away, and anybody that thinks conspiracy, they're right off the bat, conspiracy theory retards, attacking, ad hominem attacks, this, that, the other thing. Yet they're saying. They were saying yesterday, this has to be the person. You had some of the news people, the local ones. You have to go back and watch the local or listen to the audio if anybody's got it, or the video. One of the local reporters who happened to be on the ground at the time when it happened said, it's got to be more than one person. There's no way one person could have gotten away with this. And it's almost like they're trying to shape it up so they're going to blame a lone person. And maybe they will blame a group. We'll see. I'm willing to bet that they're going to try to blame. I was talking to Joe about this off air earlier, and I said to him they're going to blame like some Second Amendment loving, Constitution loving person supposedly wanted to blow the marathon up because he thinks the Sandy Hook thing was a conspiracy, and the last mile of the thing was dedicated to Sandy Hook. Yeah, of course I was being sarcastic, but I mean. There's just that's the angle. It's like they're not saying anything. They're keeping everybody with bated breath. It's like maybe they're trying to foment what angle they're going to go at because they want to see what people's reaction are going to be. I'm telling you, they learn the powers that shouldn't be. I'll tell you why I think. I'll tell you why I think, regardless of if this was real or not, right? And I don't mean video, but whether they let it happen or it was put on by them. I'll tell you why I think that. Either way, and what it means on the other side. Stay tuned. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. First, I'm going to explain why people right off the bat think there's something shady going on. Bombs going off, and there were police, military, and bomb-sniffing dogs around. Now, it's being said now, and I don't remember what official said this, but it's being said that no, there was no such thing going on. There were no bomb-sniffing dogs or anything around like that. And there's no evidence to support that. It's a conspiracy theory. It's made up by blah, 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 blah. Okay, let me refer you back to a news report that I played yesterday. It's about a minute and a half long. Let's listen, shall we?
Now, several runners from our area are in Boston. They were running in the marathon. Several we talked with were not far from the explosions when they happened today.
Yeah, Local 15's John Zanitas is live in our newsroom right now. John, the University of Mobile cross-country coach actually saw the explosion happen.
That's right, Kim. He had just finished the marathon and was walking back to the finish line to meet up with his wife. That's when the explosions started going off. His wife had been sitting in the section where one of the explosions went off, but thankfully she had left her seat to come meet up with him. He says there was just this thick, blinding cloud of white smoke. They all started running. The coach told me, though, this is interesting, before the marathon, he saw bomb-sniffing dogs and bomb spotters on the roofs at the starting line, and it appeared to him there was some sort of active threat before the explosions went off.
Well, what? But I thought that was a conspiracy theory and there was no evidence to back that up.
At the start line this morning, they had bomb spotters on the roofs of the building, and they had bomb-sniffing dogs coming up and down at the start line, and Melanie said there was bomb-sniffing dogs at the finish line, but they kept making announcements saying to the participants, do not worry, this is just a training exercise. Well, evidently, I don't believe they were just having a training exercise. I think they must have known. They must have had some kind of threat or suspicion called in.
Now, Coach Stevenson told me he's run plenty of marathons in D.C. and Chicago, other major metropolitan areas, but he's never seen that many bomb-sniffing dogs for a race. But for right now, reporting live in the newsroom, John Zanitas, Local 15 News.
Now, let me be the one to ask the most obvious question first and foremost, right? Why would officials say there's no such evidence when this guy right here is telling you, you just heard his testimony, there's evidence, and there's pictures of people walking calmly on roofs, which people were like, well, that must be a spotter or, whatever, and there was military there, police all over the place. So, multiple people have said that there were cops there, bomb-sniffing dogs. So, okay, let's say for a second, there were. Well, that goes to show, and this is where I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. Okay, because after this, what they're going to try to do is they're just going to try, it's already in the news, the major changes coming to sporting events and outdoor events and public events and blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, you're going to be getting groped and x-rayed now to be able to just go in and watch a football game if you want. Okay, so, but I'm going to kill two birds with one stone here. Okay, first, with them pushing for this, because they're going to. Okay, we need more cops on the street, more federal funding. They're already saying it. DHS can't be defunded. We see what happens. Interesting, kind of like a fund drive. Anyway, go watch A Long Kiss Goodnight. See what I'm talking about with a fund drive. A movie from I think it was 1998 or 1999. Gina Davis and Samuel L. Jackson. But so the police had dogs, right? They had whoever it was, SWAT, military, government, whatever. They had bomb-sniffing dogs. Well, what's up with the bomb-sniffing dogs not picking up either of the bombs? Isn't that what they're supposed to do? And I don't want to hear that, well, maybe they got confused or this or that. Well, then why use them? Don't you have some other type of technology? Why run around acting like these bomb-sniffing dogs are what's going to be the answer to everything if they don't work? You see, the argument is invalid. They invalidate their own argument if you actually pay attention to it. Okay? So, and that gets to my first point, that if it was a quote-unquote terror attack and it wasn't a false flag, right? Well, then they're not doing their job too well. Maybe you guys are too focused on BS threats like patriots and Christians and people that don't agree with abortion, or people that might agree with abortion, or people that like the trees, or people that don't like the trees, or people that breathe air, because that's pretty much what they're against. So if this was a legitimate attack, shame on you. You should all be fired. Your police state doesn't work. It just goes to show you that maybe if everybody was armed, this guy wouldn't have even been able to get close. Who knows? I mean, you know what? If this was legitimate, bad things happen. You can't prevent every bad thing from happening, right? So even the argument of, well, if everybody had a gun, he might have not been able to pull it off, no, that's not really valid either, because that's not completely accurate. But nevertheless, I don't want to digress too much. The point is, their argument is completely invalid. We need a bigger police state. Well, we have a huge police state already, a much bigger one since 9/11. They love to tout that that's what's prevented all these, supposed attacks that nobody knows about, only the FBI. And then these BS attacks that you see happening and going on. with Faisal Shahzad and all these other people getting caught. They're patsy crap. So, if this really, really was a real terror attack, then they failed. Their police state's garbage, and it shows their hand. It shows that none of this works, none of this protects you, and that it's all theater. That cameras out the yin-yang, and police dressed in riot gear constantly, and tanks on the streets, and loss of civil liberties, and blah 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 blah. And you're taking your guns away. None of it is going to protect you from bad stuff. It just goes to show that their argument is invalid and weak. So if it really was a real event, it totally undermines their whole police state and everything that they try to run around, all these intelligence agencies, DHS, and everything else, okay? So if it is real, fail on them. Fail. Completely fail. But I guarantee you nobody will get in trouble for not spotting this, right? Well, they can't spot everyone. Look at the record they have. Very convenient. All the patsies. Let's see if this guy, whoever, this group or person that did it, turns out to be, or they blame it on, we'll say who did it, right? Who they blame it on turns out to be a patsy or not. Okay, and that gets into the second bird that gets killed with one stone. The first one is their police state doesn't work, okay? At all, period. If this was real. Now, if you go back and listen to what that guy said, he just said that there were bomb-sniffing dogs all over the place, right? There were spotters, there were police. Well, that makes me think of the picture where the guy, again, and it's all over the internet, there's a guy strolling across the roof of the building that one of the bombs, the second one, is going off in front of. Now, this is after, obviously, the first one's gone off. This guy is not mid-run. You could see he's mid-walk. That's not a running stride, it's a walk. He's not even ducking down, and anybody that's ever been in combat or had live rounds fired over their head during training understands that your body, it reacts without you even knowing it. It's like a secondary nature to your body, like blinking or breathing. You just do it. So the guy would have hit the deck, and he didn't, unless he knew that they were going to go off, and then that would make sense why he wasn't really worried, and he was just nonchalantly strolling over to maybe take a look over the front of the building. But that's a person of interest. Now, who was that? Well, there were nobody. That wasn't a spotter or a sniper or anything, but this guy said there were spotters or snipers. So then that maybe strengthens the argument for foreknowledge, and maybe you guys let it happen at the very least to then go around and say, oh, we need more funding for police departments and federal funding. What do you want to bet? A bill will be enacted in the next few days to make sure that federal law enforcement and local law enforcement are funded for either a certain period of time or indefinitely, to stop terrorist acts like this, because we just can't have it. And I'm not saying that those poor people that are injured, I'm not making fun of them or anything like that. What I'm saying is they're being used. First, they're victimized with being blown up and hurt, and then they're being victimized. The other thing I want to get into is this. If it's a false flag, right? Bird number 2 down. Okay, I hit it with the same rock. So now we'll say it's a false flag. Well, why would the state benefit from pulling off a false flag type event, Popeye? What would they benefit from that? Well, if you look at the explosion, right? I mean, obviously there's fear, everything else. We get into the whole side issue of whatever they would try to push, but distraction. But if you look at the explosion, there wasn't that many people killed. There was a lot more injured than there were killed. And I don't want to hear that I'm being morbid and saying, well, more people should have died. I'm not saying that at all. I'm glad that only 3 people lost their lives. I wish nobody lost their lives, to be honest with you. I wish nobody was hurt yesterday at all. I wish this didn't happen. But like my father said to me growing up, you can wish in one hand and crap in the other, and tell me which one weighs more. So, if you look at the situation, and you look at what happened, and you look at the explosions and everything else, and you understand explosions, and you just look at it with some logic, and you think how these people work, maybe they would want more victims alive than they would victims dead. Because live victims. See, the enemy does this in Iraq when they attack say there's a patrol out, right, and the patrol comes under fire. They don't like to kill the soldiers. They prefer, because they understand that if the soldier's dead or the Marine is dead, then the other Marines and soldiers will, okay, he's dead, focus on the enemy and kill them. But if they wound him, then 3 or 4 of them go tend to their wounded buddy, right? Well, what if you looked at that situation and wanted to pass legislation or have backdrops to stand behind you while you pontificated about passing tyrannical laws and this and that and the other thing, right? All in the name of protecting everybody from spooky boogeymen and terrorists. Well, dead people aren't a really good backdrop. You can bring their families up only so much, and that really brings criticism, and people can, oh, well, you're politicizing this, blah, 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 blah. Right? They've learned from the past stuff they do, even though they do bring the families up and stuff, and children and all this other stuff. But what would be a better backdrop than how many injured people? 173? What would be a better backdrop for these scumbags than in the coming months to have these people that survive line them all up and have them, in Congress or at the White House or something for some special event, and they're going to have the press all over the place, and they'll pass some draconian laws, and they'll have them as the backdrop. That's when you have to look at the situation and go, I wonder who would benefit from this. Again, no foreign power would benefit from it because you would bring down all holy hell. I think they've learned that from the false flag event of 9/11, that what happens when people, when this country is attacked, whether it's from an outside source or the people are duped into thinking it's an outside source, we bring the iron boot and we put it up your rear, right? Well, I don't think any outside country is going to want to deal with that. Now, who would benefit from inside the country doing it? I don't really think any home group would benefit. You don't think any of these groups understand that if they did something stupid like this and killed innocent people, that their ass would be grass and the government would be the lawnmower? Come on. Well, they don't care about that, Popeye. Dude, use your head. They're not insane. There are some people that are in the groups that are insane, but not all of them are as crazy as the TV shows would have you believe. They know better. And why would they kill innocent people? If their beef is with the government, attacking innocent people it doesn't make any sense. The only people that benefit from this are the powers that shouldn't be, because then they, like I said, they can use the hurt innocent people as a backdrop. They can use the fear and everything to pass different laws and to keep you from looking at what they're already doing, like CISPA, draconian gun control, and other police state type actions. It's a game of chess on so many levels, ladies and gentlemen, it's almost unbelievable. We're going to break. When we come back, I got something special for you. Stay tuned.
Either we heal as a team, or we're going to crumble. Inch by inch, play by play, till we're finished. We're in hell right now, gentlemen, believe me. And we can stay here, get the shit kicked out of us, or we can fight our way back into the light. We can climb out of hell. 1 inch at a time. When you get old in life, things get taken from you. I mean, that's part of life. But you only learn that when you start losing stuff. You find out life's this game in inches. So is football. Because in either game, life or football, the margin for error is so small. I mean, 1/2 a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us. Hell yeah. They're in every break of the game, every minute, every second. On this team, we fight for that inch. On this team, we tear ourselves and everyone else around us to pieces for that inch. We claw our fingernails for that inch. Because we know when we add up all those inches, that's going to make the fucking difference between winning and losing. Between living and dying. that itch. And I know if I'm going to have any life anymore, it's because I'm still willing to fight and die for that itch. Because that's what living is. There's 6 inches in front of your face. Now I can't make you do it. You gotta look at the guy next to you. Look into his eyes. Now I think you're gonna see a guy who will go that inch with you. You're gonna see a guy who will sacrifice himself for this team because he knows when it comes down to it, you're gonna do the same for him. That's a team, gentlemen. And either we heal now as a team, or we will die as individuals.
Ideas are political.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. It's time to stop fighting amongst each other. It's time to come together and pay attention and keep our eye on the game. Apparently, the powers that shouldn't be, the people that have their hands on the controls of power right now, will stop at nothing to reach their agenda. If you haven't understood that by now, or come to that realization by now, I don't know what else you need to see or experience. They will stop at nothing. So we need to come together. We need to stop attacking one another because of our petty differences. Because we don't like this person, or we don't like that person. Either we work with them, or we can continue to argue while these scumbags, who they don't always get along either, by the way, but they manage to work together. They might screw each other over once in a while, but they manage to work together to further their agenda and their evil goal. Now, unless you want to fall prey to it, we have to stop all of this infighting. And we need to just, critiquing one another is one thing, but outright just fighting one another for the sake of fighting and to, get a better name for yourself or whatever, all that does is create a distraction. And it keeps us on a level that we'll never get any higher. It keeps us down on this level because we're able to get distracted so easily. If you can just turn that off, a lot of other things will fall into place. Personal responsibility. We're the answer to this problem, not them. If we keep going to them for the solutions to our problems, you're going to keep seeing false flag type events. And then you're going to see their media lapdogs come out and bash anybody that thinks for themselves outside the box. Let's be like Voltron. You want a visual? Anybody that grew up in the 70s and the 80s? Voltron. Okay, let's all come together. Individually, they had their own strengths and weaknesses, but let's come together and be one big badass, super robot with a sword and go kick some butt. No, I'm not talking about really being robots or cybernetics or transhumanism or anything like that. It's just a metaphor.
This is Sparta!
That's right, Leonidas. That's what I'm talking about. Let's come together and kick some evil scumbag ass. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time for this evening. I'll catch you all again tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, become an autodidact. Have no fear. I love you all.